criminal cover-up. Jamie Metzl joining us now from New York. I'm gonna get you to describe or explain why it is that you have this hypothesis, because I'm not sure there is any evidence for it. But let's just back up. This lab leak theory, it isn't new, is it? Its biggest proponents early on were right-wing US media outlets. Then a WHO investigation dismissed any link between the lab in Wuhan and the outbreak. Despite that, President Biden has ordered a US intelligence inquiry now into the origins of COVID-19, and the Senate has passed an amendment calling for another international investigation. I'm going to point out here, there's been no new evidence, no smoking gun. So why is this theory getting so much oxygen right now, do you think?
So, Becky, you talked about right-wing Republicans here in the United States being the earliest proponents of this hypothesis, but I'm a progressive, I'm a Democrat, and from the beginning of last year, 2020, I was one of the most vocal people raising the possibility that the pandemic started through an accidental lab incident. And the evidence then, which has only grown, which is entirely circumstantial, but very, very significant, is we know that the backbone virus of SARS-CoV-2 comes from horseshoe bats. They don't have horseshoe bats in Wuhan, but what they do have is China's only level 4 virology institute with the world's largest collection of bat coronaviruses that was doing highly aggressive research, making those scary viruses, as you mentioned before, more scary. We know that after the outbreak started, this virus was perfectly well adapted for humans, which is something we've almost never seen before in past outbreaks. And we know that China engaged a massive cover-up starting from day one, including destroying samples, hiding records, imprisoning people in China asking basic questions, and placing a gag order. And then you mentioned the WHO. People feel that the WHO did an investigation, but there has been no investigation. And the joint study group was not the WHO, as Dr. Tedros, the Director General of WHO, has said repeatedly. This was an independent group, and it was not a credible process.
So I have to ask, what do you have at this point, aside from a hypothesis? Because the circumstantial evidence, as far as I can tell, is not new. The Wall Street Journal has been reporting what is intelligence based on a report which was previously flagged by the Trump administration and came from outside the US. Its veracity is very hard to authenticate, isn't it? So
I'm not saying that we can prove it. My whole point is this is a very valid hypothesis, but let's take the opposite. The people who are making the argument that the natural origins hypothesis, there is no evidence at all for that. The Chinese authorities have done 80,000 sequences with no evidence. We know that the story of the wet market origin was a lie. The Chinese government knew it was a lie in January of last year. So that's why we're saying there are two valid hypotheses. Natural origins is a hypothesis. In almost every other past outbreak, there was some evidence. You could see in many ways the virus evolving as it jumps between animals and then ultimately to humans. There's none of that here. The circumstantial evidence is quite strong. If people can go to my jamiemetzl.com website, if you print it out, it's 50 pages of the background. Let people judge for themselves. There's no smoking gun. That's why what we're saying is we need a full investigation into all origin hypotheses, both natural and lab incident. And that's exactly the thing that the Chinese authorities are so actively blocking.
And any likelihood that that will change? I mean, any likelihood that Chinese authorities will cooperate at this point? Because if the international community wants to come together and run a parallel investigation, as it were, it will need cooperation from the CCP, surely.
So maybe. I mean, certainly that's why I've been pushing so hard. Right now, as you know, Becky, the World Health Assembly is meeting. So what we need is the governments of the world to mandate a full and unrestricted investigation into the origins of the pandemic with full access to all of the relevant record samples and personnel in China and beyond. If China blocks that, then the second best alternative will be for interested countries and experts around the world to come together to establish it's not ideal, a parallel process. But there's a lot of evidence that's available outside of China. All of the evidence about the now famous Yunnan mine where the closest known genetic relatives to SARS-CoV-2 were found, that all came from the outside. There have been, I'm part of a group of experts and scientists. We've been deeply exploring these issues for more than a year, and we've come up with a lot. Again, I encourage people, go to my jamiemetzl.com website, learn for yourselves, but there's a lot there. The last thing that we should do is reward China for a cover-up by saying, oh, well, let's just not even look into how the worst pandemic in a century started, because if we do, we're all going to be at unnecessary risk. And I, for one, don't want to be here 5 years from now, 10 years from now, saying there was an avoidable risk, and now 10 more million people are dead because we didn't have the courage to follow up.
The problem, of course, with the WHO-led investigation was that...
And again, Becky, it wasn't...
when it concluded...
it wasn't the WHO.
Let me make my point.
Yeah.
Right, okay, fair enough. But the under the auspices of... there was such a dearth of evidence about this coronavirus and its origins that sort of, continued to spur interest in what is this lab leak theory. What did we learn from that investigation?
So again, it wasn't an investigation by the admission of the international experts who participated in it. They called it a joint study. It's my view that that entire joint study process of independent experts and their Chinese government counterparts did actual harm. It was worse than nothing because with a 2-week, highly curated, highly controlled, essentially study tour without access to most of the raw data that they needed, this joint committee essentially parroted Chinese government propaganda claims. And that's why Dr. Tedros Adhanom immediately essentially rejected the findings of this joint study team because they had said without any evidence that they thought the natural origins was more likely, and what they called lab incident was what they said highly unlikely. They had no supporting evidence. They didn't even look into the lab incident hypothesis. That's why our group of experts around the world in our 3 open letters said here's what it will take to fully investigate.
I'm going to have to leave it there. We thank you very much indeed for joining us.